Crazy Stupid Podcast.
Thank you so much for watching. And if this is your first time tuning in, we'd love for you to hit the subscribe button and the notification button so that you are made aware of when we post our videos.
We're going to be doing something a little bit different today and for the foreseeable future, to be honest, in support of the writers and actors on strike. We will no longer be reviewing any new shows or movies that come out. Also, we won't be reviewing any old shows or movies that are from struck companies. So we're going to be turning our attention to
Books,
comics, and anime. It's kind of like a little bit gray, like what people are expected to do, but we just didn't want it to seem like we're promoting.
Right.
Like it took a couple days for me to like really even fully understand the strike.
Right.
Because it was kind of just like, okay, writers are on strike. Even that took a while for me to understand, like, okay, what does that actually mean and look like?
And then SAG kind of came in and you weren't really sure where they fit into everything.
And it just like, it just took some time to like really understand and grasp what is actually going on and what the impacts are. And then beyond that, then it's a whole other extra step to then understand what the impact is going to be on people online, content creators who are engaging with the industry but not necessarily completely a part of it. Like it's just very confusing. And I feel like, yes, definitely more grace and also just more patience. Like just hold on. Yeah. Just chill.
To your point, I think what we saw was just anxiety because I think people knew their livelihoods were going to be disrupted, which is a very valid and legitimate feeling.
I don't understand that. See, my anxiety was like, let's just shut up.
And
let's
just wait
a little while and figure
People
this out.
People process it differently, but I'm definitely with you on that.
Like,
because remember, I asked you like, "Yo, what are we gonna do?"
And we were literally almost like, I don't know.
Either way, I think WGA and SAG, they came out, and I think even for them, they probably had to think through amongst their team, amongst their lawyers, of like, what is the most effective way to keep this grassroots movement going? How do we make sure our message is clear, understandable, and tangible enough? And I think that also took time because the whole streaming thing was boycotting the streaming thing was something that came up. And I think they came out and said that like, that's not what we're really asking for. Because even that could get a little messy.
Wait, so even in the updated things that they just said, they said we're not boycotting the streaming services.
There might be information as to why, but from what I've seen from other content creators is that that's just hard to mobilize.
Oh yeah, it would be very hard to get people to
right.
It would be tough, especially because right now so many people don't even have cable.
One of the areas that my thought process went to was maybe they are trying to consider how much casualties in their movement they're trying to consider, because there's people they're going to lose some money. Actors, directors, writers, caterers, people who work in the area where you're filming your stuff, and they're like, we're considering all of it.
Yeah, but I wonder if that's one that they'll whip out later. I mean, honestly, listen, we are old enough to remember the days of pirating. We can go back. Okay.
LimeWire, what's up? Why?
I can go back. I can go back to my 1, 2, 3 movies.
I got antivirus now. Them LimeWire viruses, they ain't gonna catch me slipping.
1, 2, 3 movies. I can watch the movie in 46 different parts on YouTube. Okay.
Do you want to know what's really funny?
What?
During the LimeWire era, there was a Maroon 5 song, "Wake Up Call." When I was in high school, they were my favorite band. Like for the longest time, like I didn't have money to like buy real albums. And I wasn't going to like buy like iTunes stuff. And so I would use LimeWire.
You got that little FBI message.
I got that, yeah. But what I was going to say was I downloaded the Wake Up Call song on my phone. And apparently this was not the right version of the song. But I never knew that I downloaded the wrong version, because whenever I got a new MP3 player and I searched the song on LimeWire, I coincidentally kept choosing the wrong version of the song. Difference? There's this version where a fan kicks in and acoustically starts singing a portion of the chorus.
Wait, you didn't notice that?
No, I thought that was just Adam Levine singing. And so when I like showed one of my cousins the song, he's like, bro, what the hell is this? I was like, what are you talking about? This is the real track. No, it isn't.
That is really funny.
It went on for about a year and a half. I did not know what the real song was. Yeah. Fun times with LimeWire. My parents hated it because I just kept destroying their computers.
All those pop-ups, you just closing everything as fast as you possibly can.
Brutal. All right. Anyways, so as we mentioned, we're pivoting a lot of our content. We both binged Attack on Titan.
Yes.
You are not familiar with how it ends but I read the manga, so I won't say anything about the ending.
Okay.
I watched Fullmetal Alchemist for the first time. I'm super late, I know. Please don't judge me for anyone who's...
When did that come out?
Like 2005.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
Yeah, it's relatively old. And I understand why people say that this is like the greatest anime of all time. You watch it and it's like watching like The Lion King. Like, you know it's old, but the messaging is still heavy enough where you're just like, oh, I'm in it. The show touches on so many themes, and there's even a portion where I would argue that it handles certain themes better than Attack on Titan, in my opinion. And I'll get to a little bit of that later on. But one of the things that I loved about Fullmetal Alchemist is how they balanced the difference between the value in science and like the value in faith. And there's this idea of trying to discover and answer the question, like, what is truth? So Ed and Al, the main characters, they don't believe in a higher power. They placed all of their identity in science, the science of alchemy. But the show does a good job of showing you what happens when all of your values and all of your input is solely based in science, right? Because it shows the exploitation that people use. It shows the inhumane tendencies that can come, right? We've seen instances where like technology and science has done some pretty harmful things to people. Experiments that have happened, right? Trying to solve certain things. The removal of jobs in certain markets with nothing to really replace it. A number of different areas that you can look into and see, like, if you don't have any other values within your identity and it's just science, there's going to be something lacking.
Yeah.
And the show does a phenomenal job at balancing without trying to give a definitive answer of like science bad, religion good. It doesn't really do that. Obviously, as a person who is a spiritual person, I'm watching this and I'm very much connected to these ideas because yes, I'm spiritual, but I do believe in science, right? And so that has always been a journey that I'm navigating through to try to balance these two ideas and what makes the most sense for my worldview. And so that has been very refreshing to see how they're able to sort of navigate through these areas. But they also show the problem that like institutionalized and organized religion can have on the world, especially when institutionalized religion is connected to government. So that was the first thing that I thought was so fascinating, the way that they explored it. I think Fullmetal Alchemist explores the idea of humanizing the other better than Attack on Titan does. That was part of what you saw in the last season of Attack on Titan, and there were some flaws in the execution. I still think the show is phenomenal. I think the writing, the animation, the music is great. I'm specifically referring to, does the message land as effective as Fullmetal? And I have to say no. And here's why I say that. So you have your homunculi, and they sort of represent the 7 deadly sins.
Okay.
They're kind of like the Titans. They have an enormous amount of power without explaining too much into it, because that's a reveal you'll need to learn for yourself. And they're just kind of hard to defeat, like a Titan. But the way that they explore the emotions that are attached to what we describe as 7 deadly sins is a way that humanizes people who are experiencing those emotions. So they have one of the deadly sins, greed, right? And so naturally, we're sort of taught that greed is a terrible thing. But greed comes along and he starts listing examples of things that we desire, that we lack. And he shows that humans have sort of labeled it as something that is holistically evil, but there are moments where we look to something that we don't have, and it could be for a like good cause. And so the show sort of, particularly in that character, the show is exploring the nuanced emotions that come with the things that we sort of define as like. Another thing that they explored I thought was a little bit better was the role of governance and the role of policing and military.
Oh yeah, listen, Attack on Titan loves the military.
Right. So the attack, and this is, I think, is the difference. Attack on Titan shows you individuals who do questionably moral things, but in the end, you are left with the understanding that it is for the greater good. Like Commander Erwin does some questionable things, but in the end, you do walk away saying he had the right thing in mind and it was for like the greater good. They try to do things for Eren because they need to discover things about what happens. And so it does make sense, but the problem is one could walk away from that story and see a message of strong loyalty to military.
Into hierarchical leadership without question.
Exactly.
Yes.
What Fullmetal does, it clearly shows you the problems with that perspective because it doesn't place it on individuals, where if you swap out a bad person in the military with a quote unquote good person, all of your problems are solved. That's not how it works. And it does a phenomenal job at showing you when you have systems of governance that by its origin is designed to do something harmful, just swapping out individuals won't be enough. They have a character, one of my favorite characters, Mustang. He's this idealistic person. He has this vision of trying to make it to the top, in their mind, kind of like a king, right? And his idea is, if I get to the top and I just teach everyone throughout the org chart to be a good person, all the problems with our country will go away. But as the story unfolds, you realize sometimes it's not just about swapping out individuals. If the system itself was designed for something evil, you as an individual can be a good person all you want. We see that perspective with the military. We see it with policing. And so that, I think, is the difference between the two. When it comes to a military state or a country that uses its military and police force to control society and countries, I think Attack on Titan focuses too much on individualism, and Fullmetal explains the systems are the real problem here. Last thing, people like to talk a lot about how great some of these composers are for these movies, right? You got Hans Zimmer, John Williams, Ramin Djawadi. But we need to talk about these composers for these anime.
You think they're better or just
I
like
think they're
on par?
up there. I think they are on par.
Okay.
And I think part of the problem is there is still like sometimes there's like a negative connotation to anime. Like it's like for kids. It's animation. It's not taken as seriously. I know that stigma is kind of wearing off, but it can still exist to some degree. But the music in some of these animes that I've been watching is bananas. Oh my God. The music in Fullmetal is just flat out incredible. There's music. I mean, we've listened to it. There's moments in Attack on Titan I almost want to jump out of my seat. You know what I mean? And I feel like if you're able to get that reaction out of a person, you're doing something right. But I feel like because they're not in the Hollywood era, it's not live action, they can sometimes get overlooked for their detail in creating like impactful moments. I've seen people take the Attack on Titan soundtrack, and like the song is called Attack on Titan, and they'll place it in different scenes of completely different animes, and it still sounds phenomenal. Like, yeah. It's like taking a Hans Zimmer track and placing it in another film, and it will still work. When you're able to do that, you're doing something right. Like, you know what I mean?
It's short. It's not long, right? It's only like, 30 episodes?
I think 38 episodes.
Maybe I could finish that in a week. I got this. I got time. I'm on summer break.
I went ahead and I read Fire and Blood. Got to my head. George R. Martin. He knows how to world build. You're fascinated by all of it. There's just something almost like intoxicating about that world. It's hard to make sense out of it. It's like the politics make sense for their world, but there's like a level of relatability to the politics also. One of the things that I really loved while reading Fire and Blood for the first time are some of these subplots that are sort of happening behind the scenes, because George R. Martin does a phenomenal job in not explicitly giving you the answers to everything. And it leaves room for so much interpretation, for so much fan theory, for so much online discourse that you can just almost become consumed by all of it. And I think that's why I fell in love with that entire world in the first place. One of the things that I found one of the most interesting is during Aegon's conquest, right? So clearly the main plot is he comes to Westeros, he conquers the Seven Kingdoms. It's revealed in the show that he does all of this because he knows about the Long Night. There's like a general idea of sort of what happens. But what happens within all of that is what makes this so rich of a story. One particular example is they're trying to conquer Dorne because the Dorne is not part of the realm yet.
That's where Pedro Pascal is.
Yes. And they try for years. It doesn't work. Dorne outsmarts them. They are more politically savvy. Sometimes they're even a bit more brutal and violent than the Targaryen methods. And they can't conquer them. They just can't do it. And there's this one particular moment where Aegon gets a letter from Dorne. He reads it. He's sitting on the throne, and the writers say that he clinged onto the Iron Throne so much that his hand started to bleed. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't tell anyone what was in the letter. He crumbles up the letter, throws it in the fire, burns it, flies to Dragonstone, comes back to King's Landing, and then agrees to the terms with the Dornish people, and the war between them ends. And we don't ever really find out what was in the letter. Now, there are some clear ways that you can interpret it on what was there, and a lot of fans give strong evidence to things that they believe is what he read, but it's not definitively mentioned, and that I find so fun. Another thing that I thought was interesting is George R. Martin does a phenomenal job at showing you that dragons are powerful weapons, but they are not infallible. One of the ways that they show us is, yeah, you can use these dragons to conquer people, but what does governing look like? Once you've conquered, what do you do next?
Yeah, the conquering is not really the hardest part.
Right. The conquering is easy. What it becomes more tricky is the governing. And the way that he explores what the role of governance should look like in society through the Targaryens is a very refreshing and interesting take, because they have all this power, and you see through different kings throughout their lineage how some understand it better than others. And that I found very refreshing, because yeah, dragons do represent power, but what you do with it is really going to determine how people look at you throughout history. The last thing that I'll say is Fire and Blood really shows the power of propaganda. Oh my goodness. These maesters are kind of biased, whether it's to Targaryens in general or to certain Targaryen people. You can't really trust everything that they're saying. What happens when history can potentially be written by a governing power that wants to maintain its supremacy over the people it's governing? Some of the way that they talk about the Targaryens is clearly trying to present a message of superiority and supremacy over other people. They sort of perpetuate this idea that they're above everyone else. And then you have the maesters, who are essentially the history of the realm, sort of supporting it. And so if you've got the maester saying it, then it must be true. But you sort of realize as you're reading it, they're just as human as everyone else. There are even Targaryens who tried to bind the dragons, and that did not work out well.
I'm realizing in this conversation that the Targaryens are imperialists.
Yeah.
And that did not occur to me. I don't know how, because they do tell you in the show that they did conquer.
It's messy because there's history there where you're not really sure if Aegon fully interpreted the dream accurately, because he's like, yes, the long night is coming. That is a fact. But he believes the dream is telling him that it has to be a Targaryen. Now, he could be right, and maybe it was through prophetic influence that you have Jon and Dany. Maybe it's a coincidence.
At the time when the Night King is defeated, neither one of them is on the throne. At the time when they're defeated, there is not a Targaryen on the throne.
Right.
So like, don't you just need the dragons to help, but you don't have to be the king to help.
I think that's part of the justification. I mean, like, you saw it with like Puritans and Pilgrims. Like, part of their motive was, well, we need to teach these people about our God because we think we're going to save their lives, right? Mm-hmm. And so you sort of use what you think is a justifiable motive, and in the process there are a number of unjustifiable acts that happen. Like, yeah, there were some great kings, but there were also some terrible Targaryen rulers. And there was also a lot of civil war. There was also a lot of revolts, because the book does a good job of showing you that there's a lot of people in Westeros that do not bang with their culture, but they just can't successfully revolt against them because they've got dragons.
Well, this kind of puts the whole thing with the Hightowers and their religion that Alicent starts putting in the castle.
Yeah,
it kind of shades it in a different light, because I feel like watching the show was like, here she go taking over, and now I'm like, what if they were suppressing that? Like, what?
Because they did have their own gods, like the weirwood trees, the ones with the faces on them that they would see.
Yeah, and the god, the seven,
the light of seven. But not everyone in Westeros believed in the light of the seven, though. So it makes it a little murky. That's my rant. I know I talked for way too much, but I want to hear about these books that you got.
So before we even decided to switch up and read about and do something about books, I was already going to switch gears a little bit from what I usually read, and I was going to read this book called Chain Gang All-Stars, which is by this author who I can't remember his name right now, but he did this really good book of short stories called Friday Black, which is basically like Black Mirror, but it's like everything is about Black people, but like the stories are like kind of sci-fi, like otherworldly. They just kind of they just take racism and they show you just like how absolutely absurd it is by taking it to its extreme. And it was very good. I literally read it in a single setting. And he now has a book coming out called Chain Gang All-Stars, which is, if you're interested, you should be. It is set in a prison industrial complex similar to our own, but not our own. But in this prison industrial complex, they have like gladiator fights essentially between the inmates. And it's about these two Black women who are described as sort of like Amazonian because they do these gladiator fights, who are trying to escape out of this system. I can't wait to read it, but there was a 10-week wait at the library, so that'll be a while. Yeah.
You can't buy it?
I could, but I'm trying to read it for free. But that was like, okay, if I can't read that, then let me, read into some other Afro-futurist books. Gotcha. So here are some of the books that I'm reading about Afrofuturism. Okay, so first of all, I have two books by this author who I just discovered today. Her name is Nalo Hopkinson. I don't know if other people know her. I feel like she's not as well known as like Octavia Butler, but I feel like she should be talked about in like that same conversation. So I got this book, Brown Girl in the Ring by Nalo Hopkinson. Nalo Hopkinson is an author who is Caribbean, and she writes Afro-futurist novels that have like Caribbean influence. So the characters are Caribbean a lot of times, and she also infuses like Caribbean folklore and mythology and things like that into her stories as like real parts of what their world. I've never heard of that. I feel like there's a lot of authors that I know that do like Afrofuturism from like an African angle, like different parts of Africa, but I've just never heard of it from a Caribbean, and I'm very excited. This one is a book of short stories called Skin Folk. Listen to this one description of one of the short stories. In A Habit of Waste, a self-conscious woman undergoes elective surgery to alter her appearance. Days later, she's shocked to see her former body climbing onto a public bus. Then I got this book called Lagoon. I don't know how to say the author's name, but she also wrote Who Fears Death, which if you don't know Who Fears Death, that is a magical realism story that got the attention of none other than George R.R. Martin, who at last I heard was in the process of adapting it into a television show. It's basically just a story of like the conflict when these aliens arrive in Africa, in Nigeria in particular, because I think the author is Nigerian, and they are trying to become citizens. And then I also got a book by Colson Whitehead. If you don't know Colson Whitehead, he wrote The Underground Railroad, which sort of Afrofuturism. It's about the Underground Railroad and slavery, but in the book, it's a literal train underground that takes people to varying locations. So kind of like just a little spin on the real thing. But the book itself, like the slavery feels very real. It's kind of like a zombie apocalypse type story. There was a plague, and it left two groups of people. Well, actually, technically three, but there was the people who were infected, who are like the living dead. And then there were the people who were not infected. But this is happening post all of that. So they're now in the aftermath of all of this. So it's not a zombie apocalypse. It's after that. And they're actually trying to civilized society. So they're in the process of going back into major cities and taking them back.
So they've got like a cure or a vaccine or something.
Yes, it's like done. Like the apocalypse is done. And now they're trying to take back their cities so that people can live in them again.
That's so fascinating, because anytime any zombie apocalypse content that I have consumed, it always ends, or many of them end, when they're on the cusp of trying to rebuild it, but you never see it done. Mm-hmm. Like you see attempts and you see some failures of them trying to coexist with it, like in The Walking Dead or in The Last of Us, but not like that.
I love these types of stories in general, right? As I've been reading Harry Potter, I've been reading, all that stuff since I was a kid. And now there's just so many more authors of color that are inserting Black people and centering Black people, and even creating worlds, like creating these futuristic or fantasy worlds around different aspects of Black culture, that I just think is so good.
Man, I need to read Who Fears Death.
Yes,
I only hear good things about it.
It was very good. It's very, very good.
The Who Fears Death thing, it's always bittersweet for me, because you had George R.R. Martin literally saying this needs to be made into a television show. And George R.R. Martin is one of the most influential people in fantasy, ever. He's up there with everyone else that you could probably think of.
Yeah, they'll probably talk about him in the same breath as like Tolkien,
mm-hmm.
The Rings.
Yeah. We were told that we were going to get a TV show on Who Fears Death a long time ago, because the book was successful. People loved it. It has a very strong following, and critics reviewed it very well. I think this is a clear example of when you hear white fans say, make your own stories. Well, as this writer's strike and actor strike has told us, you cannot always rely on the good conscience of these companies to do the right thing, to make the inclusive decision, because look how they dragging their feet with this. We were been supposed to have this. And if you needed any more proof of the racism in the Hollywood movie television industry, you have a story from a book that is being promoted by the George R.R. Martin, and these studios were still dragging their feet. What bigger cosign, what bigger praise would you need other than one of the greatest authors and producers for one of the greatest shows ever than George R. Martin? And you're still like, Nah, we're not sure. Like, I don't know.
I don't know what's going on. So I don't know what is exactly the holdup, or like if it's in
just
production
kinda,
or if
no,
I don't
it's
know
not.
anything.
It's just it's not shelved, but it's not moving forward. Same thing with Children of Blood and Bone. If you want more inclusive stories, you got to give these writers a chance. And it's not that far-fetched for the writer for Children of Blood and Bone to want to be a writer and a producer, because HBO did that with George R. R. Martin. Mm-hmm. You can do the same thing.
We'll get our visual adaptation someday. I mean, they turned The Underground Road into that show on Amazon Prime.
Yeah, but fantasy, like the other two, can pull a larger audience.
Yeah.
And I think would do more for the cause. And this is not a knock to Underground Railroad.
Yeah, it's not really fantasy in that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And it isn't.
It's a bit more grounded.
Yeah, and
it's the kind of story that they like to tell.
Yes,
yeah.
But it's centered around slavery, which I think people are wanting more stories outside of that. Mm-hmm. Which that's fine. That's understandable. We've gotten that for decades.
Yeah.
You know, we deserve to see Black people in a different light. Anyways, we'd love to get some book recommendations and some anime recommendations. We've been putting together a list of things that we want to read and write. Read and write. Yes, I said that correctly. Esther's going to write a book. She just doesn't know it yet.
I've never said that.
Oh, this is the last thing I'll say about the writer's strike. I know we're all like super excited to support these writers and actors. There is going to come a time when social media sites and media companies and journalists, it's not going to be on the news. And so it might feel like the momentum is over. And that's probably the best time to give your most support, because right now it's kind of hot. It's kind of trendy, but there will be a moment where the news stops covering it in the same level. We saw this in 2020 when we were having real in-depth conversations about race, and they were promoting books. A lot of great, intelligent Black authors and scholars were getting invited onto shows and podcasts, and then it kind of slowed down. If you were to check back into a lot of these nonprofits who were being given money and grants, a lot of those funds have stopped. We just did some of my partners at the university. We met with some nonprofits, and when we asked them what was some of their biggest roadblocks, they said these companies just stopped giving money. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. Don't join the movement just because it's trendy. You gotta join it to be in the long haul. That's the difference. All right, y'all. Thank you all again, and we will see you all next time. Peace.